So the Mishnah yesterday, which I'm probably going to have to review again when others join, started our new parak, the ninth parak of Mizbeach Mikadesh et Oila, right? That which is appropriate for the Mizbeach, that's put on the Mizbeach, even if it's puzzle, becomes Mikudash, right? And then we had a machloket in the Mishnah. We had three opinions in the Mishnah. What's that? Three opinions in the Mishnah. One was the first opinion, where mine was Rabbi Yoshua. Yeah, who said that the when it says Mizbeach Mekadesh it's a Ra'oila, it means Kol HaRa'oili Ishim. It has to be Ra'oi for the flames, meaning it has to be something you burn on a fire, which we took to mean meat as opposed to liquids, as opposed to blood and oil, not oil, blood and wine from the Zevachim. Rabbi Gamliel said it's anything that's Ra'oil Mizbeach, so anything that goes on the Mizbeach, including things like blood. Rabbi Shimon said it depends. It depends on whether it's the main thing or it's a secondary thing. That the problem with nisachim is not that they're liquid. The problem is that they're secondary, right? That really you bring a karban, and the Torah says bring a karban and add some spice, not spices, add some wine to it. So because it's secondary, it doesn't have as high a status, and it can't stay on the mizbeach if it's pasul or if the carbon is pasul. Those were three opinions yesterday. And then we had two more opinions in a Braita on the bottom of Pegim Yom Bet, Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili said, well, the important thing here is that there's a pasuk that says the word kfasim, which means sheep, right? And so the things that stay on the Mizbeach, if they're puzzle, have to be like sheep, meaning they have to be animals, is how we understood it. And not birds, and not minachot, right? Not flour, and certainly not wine. And Rabbi Akiva said, no, no, it's olah meaning it's brought up as a sacrifice, which included birds, but excluded minachot. So according to Rabbi Akiva, flour would not stay up, and everyone agrees that wine would generally not stay up, except for the opinion of, well, not everyone, but both Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Akiva. So it says Reish Lakish today, two lines from the bottom. We're going to do it. Amar Reish Lakish. It says Reish Lakish, in case you're not able to remember these things that easily, I'm going to summarize it all for you. So mincha haba'a b'fnei atzma. If you have a carbon mincha, right, flour, and you bring it up to the mizbeach, it's brought on its own. It's like you just give a mincha or you have a carbon mincha, and it's tamei and it's not kosher. Does it stay on the mizbeach or not? So says Rabbi Reish Lakish, L'divrei kulan lo tered. According to all of them, now all of them means the majority, and in this case it means the three in our Mishnah, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Shimon. According to all three of them, lo tered. It doesn't go off the mizbeach because since it's a carbon and since it's brought on its own, it stays on the mizbeach. But the different Rabbi Yossi Glili and Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Yossi Glili and Rabbi Akiva, to the top of Daf Pei Dalet now, tered. It has to go off the mizbeach because it's not an animal. Okay, so that is one thing. You're going to ask, of course, this is obvious. The Gemara will ask that in a second. But second word now, in Pei Dalet, mincha haba'al im hazevach. Now, what about a mincha that's brought with a carbon? So there, the different Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Yoshua lo tereit. Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua both say if it's a carbon, right, either ishim or mizbeach, it stays on the mizbeach. But the different kulin, according to the other three, meaning Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah, and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili, tered, right, for different reasons. According to Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, it's because it's not an animal. And according to Rabbi Shimon, it's because it's not brought on its own, right? It's secondary to the carbon. Next, last word on the second line, nisachim haba'im b'fnei atzman. Now you have wine that you bring on their own. You just walk up to Beit HaMikdash and say, I'm just motivated to give this bottle of wine to the Mizbeach, right? And they would take it and pour it on the Mizbeach, right? But in that case, the divrei kulan yardu. According to everybody, now again, everybody means three rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who say it's not an animal, so wine for sure goes off, and Rabbi Yoshua, who says if it's not for the flames, it goes off the mizbeach, it goes off, yardu. But the different Rabbi Gamliel for Rabbi Shimon, lo yardu. According to Rabbi Gamliel, it doesn't go off because it's for oil mizbeach. According to Rabbi Shimon, it doesn't go off because it's brought on its own. It's the wine. But nisachim ba'im mazevach. But the fourth case, if you have wine that's brought with the carbon, then according to all four people, it goes off. But according to Rabbi Gamliel, it stays on. The divrei kulan yardu. The divrei Gamliel lechudei lo yardu. Okay, that was Reish Lakish's summary of the daf, basically. Says the Gemara, well, thank you, Reish Lakish, but we're not idiots. Pshita, that's obvious. I could have learned that too. What's the Chiddush? Will Rish Lakish give me lists of things? Says the Gemara, well, the Chiddush Rish Lakish wanted to introduce to you is that there's a concept of a mincha that's brought on its own, right? You can walk up and say, Mincha haba'a b'fnei atzma itzrichalei kiderava. Not really a mincha, I'm not mincha of a flour, but a minchat nisachim. That you can walk up to the Beit HaMikdash and say, here's a bottle of wine. I want to bring this as a gift. Torah never talks about, Torah never mentions bringing your own bottle of wine. It says, if you have a karban, bring nisachim with it. Never says, just bring nisachim. So how do you know that's even possible? That's the Chiddush. Amar Rava mitnadev adam minchat nisachim b'chol yom. Says Rava, no, you want to come up every day and give a bottle of wine to the Beit HaMikdash. You can do that. Says Gemara, that's thank you, Rish Lakish, for teaching me that. Why don't you just say that? Nishmeinan kinder Rava. Just say you can bring minchat nisachim. Why do you have to go through this whole thing? Says Gemara, well, there's another Chiddush, and that is nisachim habayim mazevach etzrichalei, talking about the nisachim that are brought with the karban. Right? Because now this is very interesting, and hopefully you're remembering all Zevachim Nava, so you got this all. Because generally, when you bring a karban, you have to bring it that day, right? If it stays overnight, it's puzzle. But there's an exception, not really an exception, but there's a different detail by Nisachim, which we mentioned earlier, if you recall, but we're going to say it again, that if you bring a karban and you have to bring Nisachim with the karban, remember, Nisachim are, as we say in the Musaf on every holiday, right? Minchatam v'niskehem, right? The mincha and the Nisachim, meaning the wine. You can do that on a different day. So we said earlier you can do it up to 10 days later. So if you bring your karban on Tuesday and you just don't have the wine ready or whatever, you have to rush to a doctor's appointment, you can come back on Thursday and bring your nisachim. So you might have thought, wait a second, if you come back on Thursday and bring your nisachim, is that considered to be connected to the karban or not connected to the karban? Because Rabbi Shimon, remember, said if it's brought on its own and it's pasul imola lo tered, but if it's brought as secondary to a karban, it has to go down. Now, what if it's secondary to a karban, but it's 5 days later? Right? Where does that fit? So that's the middle ground. And the Chiddush of Reish Lakish is that, of course, that goes down. That's still secondary to the karban. So let's read that inside. So it says the Gemara, the Chiddush is Nisachim Abayim Mazevach Etzrichalei, case of Nishachim that are brought with the Zevach, to come Makriv Lulim Machar Liyuma Achriti, I guess would be the Uchra, is what the Shita says. You bring it tomorrow or the next day. Because Sakinai Techamina, I would have thought, Hov Amar Mar, since we learned earlier, Minchatam Miniskehem tells you. Remember, it keeps saying by every Karban Musaf of the 12 Nisiim, Minchatam Miniskehem, Minchatam Miniskehem. So, Belaila, Minchatam Miniskehem Lamachar, you can do it even at night, even the next day. You might think that if you do it later, Kinisachim Aba'im B'fnei Atzman Dami, that it's its own karban, because even though it's secondary to the main karban, it's brought on a different day. Umodi Rabbi Shimon de lo yirdu, and Rabbi Shimon would admit that it doesn't come off the mizbeach. Kamash malan, that he does not, and that it's a separate thing. That's right, it's a connected thing, and it would come off the mizbeach. So that was the chiddush of Rish Lakish. Perfect. Perfect timing, Miriam. Says the Mishnah now. Top of Daf Pei Dalid Amid Aleph. Now, very often the Gemara does this. It's a very interesting thing where basically you would think this would have been the first Mishnah in the parak, but it's actually the second Mishnah. Remember, the first Mishnah said the different things that you put on the Mizbeach, if they're puzzle, you don't have to take them off. If they're an animal, if they're a bird, if they're all those things. Our Mishnah comes and says, what are the psulim that you don't have to take off? What are the psulim? So says the Mishnah now, Mishnah on Pei Daled Amid Aleph, Elu im alun lo yardu. The following psulim, if you brought that on the Mizbeach and then you realized, oh boy, it's an animal that is tameh, let's say, you don't take it off. And what are those categories? Halan, an animal, and again, whether a bird's included or flowers included or wine is included or blood is included or all the 5 Tanaim we had yesterday, right? Some say yes, some say no. So in all those different cases, but let's say it is lan, it stayed overnight, right? So you're supposed to burn the animal and sprinkle, you burn the animal overnight. If the morning comes and it's not burnt and it's not yet on the Mizbeach, and then it becomes pasul with lina. If you bring it up on the Mizbeach, then it's a psul, but it's there. So that stays up. Or hayotze, a carbon that was left the Beit HaMikdash, right? Any carbon that leaves the klaim, the walls of the Beit HaMikdash, becomes pasul. Let's say you forgot, you brought it back in, and you put it on the Mizbeach. Or tameh. This is an easy one, right? The meat became tameh. Or nishchat chutz l'zman chutz l'mkomo. Or when you did the shechita of the karban, you had the wrong intention. You had intention, I'm going to eat it in 3 days, or I'm going to sprinkle the blood in 2 days, right? Which is chutz lizmano or chutz limkomo. Or shekiblu psulin v'zarku et damo. Or the person who accepted the blood was pasul. Let's say he was a kohen who's tameh, right? Or Yisrael maybe, which we're going to see is not the case. But from this point, you don't know the difference. So in all of those cases, im alu lo yirdu, right? If it goes up, you don't take it off. Rabbi Yehuda says, wait a second, I got a few exceptions for this rule. And says Rabbi Yehuda Omer, shenishchat balayla, you shecht an animal at night, which you're not allowed to do for a karban, right? You are allowed to do for a regular animal, but not for a karban. Or nishpach dama, or if the blood gets spilled out, so there's no blood to put on the mizbeach, so you basically have an animal without blood. Or yotzeh dama chutz liklaim, or the blood went outside the Beit HaMikdash, and so it's no longer can be brought back in and sprinkled. In those three cases, in malta tered, even if you bring up the meat on the Mizbeach, you have to take it off the Mizbeach. So those are three exceptions. Rabbi Shimon says, I disagree. Lo tered. I don't think those cases should go off the Mizbeach, even though you shechted at night, even though you lost the blood. If you brought the meat up to the Mizbeach, you leave it up on the Mizbeach. She Rabbi Shimon Omer, now we're in the middle of the Mishnah, because Rabbi Shimon has a principle. And Rabbi Shimon's principle is, Kol shipsulo bakodesh, hakodesh mikablo. Anything that becomes pasul in the Kodesh, then the Kodesh, meaning the Mizbeach in this case, accepts it, draws it in. Now, what does Psulo Kodesh mean? So Rashi always explains, and Tosfos always argues, that Rashi always explains that Psulo Kodesh means it becomes pasul in the Azara, in the Azara, meaning you brought it to the Azara, and when you brought it, it was Kodesh, and then something happened, which usually means you shechted it with the wrong intention, or it became tameh, or it stayed overnight, all those cases we just had. Tosfos does not like that. We'll see why. Well, I can tell you why if we get there. But Tosfos says psul bakodesh means a psul in the shechita or later. So it's not a question of location; it's a question of the time of the shechita. Meaning, up till the zman of shechita it was okay. Once you did shechita, something went wrong. So psul in the act of kodesh, which is again, there's very technical. You'll see that the technical difference would be. I'll give you an example. Let's say you brought an animal to the Azara and it was kosher, and then you worshipped it as avodah zarah in the Azara. Probably didn't happen very often, right? So that's a psul. So we'll see. Rashi makes it sound like that would not be a good, even though the Gemara seems to imply it would. So Rashi implies that that would be psulo shalo b'kodesh. I'm sorry, psulo b'kodesh because it's in the Azara, but since it happened before the Shechita, according to Tosfot, it would be pasul before it got to Kodesh. But anyway, so that's
But
a very unusual case, as you can
don't
imagine.
we say that shchita is actually not part of the avodah?
Shechita, it's what right. Shechita is not part of the avodah, but it's where you start. Well, it's part of the avodah. It's just not needed to be done by a kohen. But
Right.
right, but it's the beginning of the service of that animal. I mean, it's irreversible. Let's put it that way, right? You
Well,
can't. So meaning once you started the shechita, you started the process, right?
okay.
So that's how Tosfos understands it. Again, the
Okay.
case I gave you is a very rare case where they argued about this before. This was earlier in the Masechta. But Rashi always says what he says here. Kodesh means in the Azara. Once you bring it into the Azara, that's the psul. So says Rabbi Shimon, Kol shepsulo b'kodesh hakodesh mikablo, lo haya psulo b'kodesh ein hakodesh mikablo. If the psul is not in Kodesh, meaning let's say Rashi's pshat, not in the Azara, then the Kodesh, meaning the Mizbeach, will not be makabel. What's the example? Elu shelo haya psulim b'kodesh. What are some psulim that happen before you get to the Beit HaMikdash? So that's a psul in the animal. For example, haravea v'nirva. Right? Let's say someone slept with this animal, a man or a woman, it's Ravea Nirva, the animal becomes pasul from the Mizbeach. If you brought it up and shechted it and put it on the mizbeach, you would have to take it off, according to Rabbi Shimon. Or muktzah. Muktzah is an animal that was designated for avodah zarah. Or ne'avat, an animal that was worshipped for avodah zarah. Or etnan umechir. Remember, etnan umechir are different exchanges for sex, done by for a prostitute or other things. Mechir kelev. Aklayim, an animal that's a mixed breed. So the Torah says, and we're going to learn this later, that it's pasul from the mizbeach. Hatrefa, an animal that's a trefa, again, is pasul from the Mizbeach. Yotzei Dofen, an animal that's born not, through Yotzei Dofen, we call it cesarean, but they obviously an animal doesn't call that. But an animal that's born that way is not kosher from the Mizbeach. Ubale Mumin, an animal at the mum. So all these animals, if you brought them to the Mizbeach, since the psul happened before you actually brought them to the Azara or before you did Shechita, you can't leave them on the Mizbeach. Now, Rabbi Akiva was machshir b'balei mumin. And Rabbi Akiva said, no, 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 balei mumin are okay. And if you recall, we discussed this earlier, and we're going to discuss it again, that it wasn't all balei mumin. Remember, we said it was the dokin sheba'ayin, the very minor balei mumin, because they're kosher for a bird, and therefore, anyways, we'll discuss this more. But Rabbi Akiva disagrees about some balei mumin. Um, that is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim says, and we'll see in the Gemara what he is responding to, because Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, if you recall, was a much earlier Tana, right? Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim was in the time of Beit HaMikdash. And he said, Tocha haya abba et balei mumim yaga be'mizbeach. I remember my father, said Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, presumably his father was a Kohen too, right? I remember my father pushing these off the Mizbeach, right? So he would actually take these things that were on the mizbeach that were puzzle. Now we don't know which psulim he's talking about, right? But these were puzzle, and my father would actually push them off the mizbeach. So we'll see in the Gemara what he's adding. Now ends the Mishnah. Geshem shim alu lo yirdu. Just like the rule is that if a puzzle animal goes up on the mizbeach, you don't take it off, you burn it. Kach im yardu lo ya'alu. If it did come off, let's say it fell off, or you took it off, or the Kohen brought it up and said, "Oh my God, it's wrong," and he walked it back down. If you didn't ask, you don't bring it back up. You don't say, "Oh, wait a second." Once it touched the mizbeach, it's allowed to go back. It's only while it's on the mizbeach that it remains in that status. V'kulan sha'alu chayim l'rosh hamizbeach yardu. And certainly, it's only talking about a shechted animal. If you took an animal that was, say, tameh or treifa or whatever, or let's say tameh is easier, and you walked it up to the mizbeach, you don't say, "Oh, okay, now we can leave it here and we shecht it," right? You take it off because it's not shechted yet. We're only referring to the meat, not the animal itself. However, the final halacha in the Mishnah, which is not related to the tameh, ola sha'ota chaya l'rosh hamizbeach. Let's say you have a regular carbon ola, and for whatever reason, I don't know how this would happen, you walked it up to the mizbeach alive, so you didn't shecht it, right? Says the Mishnah, tered, you're not supposed to shecht it on the top of the mizbeach. That would be very messy, right? And would certainly ruin the surface for quite some time. So take it off. But if, let's say, you didn't, shachta b'rosh hamizbeach, if you did shecht it on top of the mizbeach, we're going to see all this in the Gemara. There's a halacha that you're not supposed to take it off in order to prepare it. Remember, after you shecht the animal, you have to skin it and you have to cut into pieces. So animals are big, if anyone's seen an animal, right? It's a lot of work, but you're not supposed to take it off the mizbeach. Once it's on the mizbeach, and if you shechted it there, you're supposed to do all that work on the mizbeach. So that would make a very difficult day in the Beit HaMikdash. So you have shit v'yinatcha b'mekoma. You should skin it. Shit means to skin it, and you should cut it up in its place, meaning on the top of the mizbeach. So again, that was very discouraged, but that's what you'd have to do. So that's our Mishnah. Now, says the Gemara, what in the world is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, right? Because according to Rabbi Shimon, it makes a lot of sense, right? He says anything that's psul b'kodesh stays on the mizbeach. If it's a psul shelo b'kodesh, it doesn't stay on the mizbeach. We don't know why he says that, but that's at least there's a clear principle. The Rabbi Yehuda said, well, these three things, im Allah terei, where did he get three things from? So I'm going to read the pasuk to you, which we're about to read in the Gemara, but it's confusing these psukim. So the source for all of this, which we discussed yesterday, is in Parshat Tzav, right? In Parak Vav, pasuk Bet, which says the following. It says, it's the second pasuk in Tzav, Tzav et Aaron vet banav limar, zot Torah ta'olah, right? This is the Torah ta'olah. Hi ha'olah al mokta al ha-mizbeach kol halayla, right? It's the olah that's on the moked, on the flame, on the mizbeach. So yesterday, we discussed whether Rabbi Yeshua said the word mokta matters, Rabbi Gamliel said the word mizbeach mattered, right? The end of the pasuk is Esha mizbeach tukadba, what that word matters. But says Rabbi Yehuda today, keep my name straight, look at the first part of the pasuk. It says Zot Torat Ha'olah, right? This is the halacha of the olah. Says the Rabbi Yehuda, now in the Gemara, Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Zot Torat Ha'olah. Zoti Ha'olah. Sorry, I read the word wrong. It said the following, Zot Torat Ha'olah, Hi Ha'olah, right? So he's darshing the word Zot and the word He, and Rashi is the Hey of Ha'olah, right? So those are the three limudim he has. And they're each mi'ut. They're all this, right? Zot is this. He is this. Ha is this. So they're all saying this one, implying, and not another one. So says Rabbi Yehuda, Zot hi ha'olah, harei elu shlosha mi'utim. There are three exceptions. So basically, the Torah is saying everything is an olah, even if it's possible, put it on the mizbeach, except for three things. And what are the three things? The ones he said in the Mishnah. Pratlan shenishchata b'layla, if you shechted the animal at night, or nishbach dama, or the blood was poured out, or yatsa dama chutz l'klaim, or the blood went outside the Beit HaMikdash. And in those three cases, shim alta tered. In those three cases, even if you put it on the mizbeach, take it off the mizbeach. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Okay. Rabbi Shimon says, and this is the Braita expanding on our Mishnah, Ola, you know what? The Torah says the word Ola, again, before we get to um, the drasha. Ainli ela Ola, Shira. I would only know you put on the Mizbeach an Ola, that's a kosher Ola, that everything was done properly. Minayin lerapot, how do I know to include all the psulim? And he gives a longer list than our Mishnah now. So some of it's in our Mishnah, but he includes extra things. So for example, Nishchata B'layla. Remember, it's Rabbi Yehuda excluded. Or nishbach dama, he spilled out the blood. Yatsa dama chutz l'klayim. All three of those cases, Rabbi Huda excluded. And then he goes to our Mishnah's cases. Halan, overnight. Yotze, went out. Tamei, nishchat chutz zmano chutz l'mkomo. Kiblu psulim zarku damo. And then he adds some more. Hanitanim lamata shenatan lamala. Let's say you have a carbon, ola, or shlamim, right, which is supposed to be done on the bottom, and by mistake you did it on top, so you did it in the wrong place. Or lamala shnatan lamata. I'm talking about olat behema, of course, right? Or if something that's supposed to be done on the top, like a chatat, and you did it by mistake on the bottom, shnatan lamata. Or nitanim b'chut shenatan b'fnim, right? The carbonot of outside, you put it inside by mistake. Or nitanim b'fnim shenatan b'chutz. Or pesach v'chatat sheshachtan shelo lishman, which we know from the first Mishnah, right? A pesach and a chatas have to be done lishman. All of these cases are psulim. Says Rabbi Shimon, how do you know that if olah lo tered? Minayin, how do you know to include those? Talmud Omar, Torah Ta'olah. Therefore, it says at the end of the pasuk, right? This is at the end of the whole parsha, Zot Torah Ta'olah. Actually, that's in the beginning. It says in the beginning of the parsha, Zot Torah Ta'olah. Riba Torah Achat L'chol Ha'olim. It's one Torah, one rule for all karbanot olah, and really not olah, but olin means anything that's brought on the mizbeach. Shem alu lo yardu. Okay, so says Rabbi Shimon, it's a very broad exception, right? Well, not exception, but exemption from taking it off the Mizbeach. You might think, well, then it should be everything, right? Yachol shani marbeh. So you might even include animals where the animal is puzzle itself. For example, all the cases of our Mishnah, harovea v'anirva, or a muksa, or nevat, right? Avodah zarah, or the first one's rovea nirva, etnan u'mechir, u'klayim, u'treifa v'yotze dofen. What about all those cases? Talmud lomar zot. Well, it doesn't say Torah Tola. It doesn't say Elu Torah Tola. It says Zot Torah Tola. So Zot is a miut and Torah Tola is a riboy. So you exclude one category and you include the other category. Says the Gemara or the Braita, Mara ita rabotat elo hotziat elo. So how do you know which category to exclude and which one to include? Says the Gemara, again, it's not clear if it's the Gemara or the Braita speaking still, but probably the Gemara. Achar sheriba katuv, turn to pay Dalet on the bet. Achar sheriba katuv a miut, right? Since the Torah basically said, include some things from the words Torah Ta'olah and exclude some things from the word Zot. So therefore, you got to use your brain, right? Or tradition. Marbeh aniyat elo shahayab sulan b'kodesh. So I would include that you can leave on the Mizbeach the following karbanot following psulim, because they happened in Kodesh, for example, Tameh and Lan and, all the machshavot. Umotzi aniyat elo shelo hayab sulan b'kodesh. And I exclude the following because they were not psulim b'kodesh. So that is Rabbi Shimon. It's just an expansion of what he said in the Mishnah. And Rabbi Shimon says, basically, the Torah says, Zot Torah Olah. Zot means only this. Torah Olah means all of them. And so you exclude this category and you include that category. Very straightforward, right? But what about Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda said there's three psukim, three words, Zot, he, and ha, the hay of ha'olah, right? And that excludes three things that if you put them on the Mizbeach, you got to take them off. But says the Gemara, how about everything else? How does Rabbi Yehuda even know that a psul that's put on the Mizbeach is allowed to stay on the Mizbeach if he doesn't darshan what Rabbi Shimon darshans? Ask the Gemara, the third line, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda, it's not a question, it's a statement. Rabbi Yehuda would learn it from the following source. How does he even know that things that are put on the Mizbeach are allowed to stay on the Mizbeach? And the answer is he learns it from this Braita. What does the Braita say, the fourth line now? Nipnei ma amru lan bedam kasher. Says the Braita, an interesting formulation. Why do we say that if you have blood that stayed overnight that's puzzle, that was put on the Mizbeach, it can stay on the Mizbeach, right? How do we know that? Meaning, how do we know this halacha, which is basically our Mishnah, that if you're lan bidam, right, you take blood, you leave it overnight, which again, you're supposed to throw it away, but if you then put it on the Mizbeach, then it's kosher to stay on the Mizbeach. How do you know that? Says the Braita, Shari lan basar, Shari lan kasher be'imurim. Because if you took the parts of the animal, which are burnt on the Mizbeach, they're also supposed to be burned overnight. If you left them till the morning and you put them on the Mizbeach by mistake, you're allowed to leave them on the Mizbeach. How do you know that? Right? It says Gemara, Lan be'emurim kasher, sharei lan kasher be'basar. And this is really the limit. Because when it comes to the meat, basar here means the edible part, right? There is a karban, there is a situation in which you can eat the meat of the karban even though it stayed overnight. And what's that situation? A carbon shlamim, because a shlamim is eaten for 2 days. So a shlamim is shechted on Sunday. You're supposed to bring it on the mizbeach by that night, but you can eat it all day Monday. So now, of course, it's not really relevant, right? Because the meat is supposed to be burned on that night and eaten the next day. But basically, what Rabbi Yehuda is saying, or we're saying in Rabbi Yehuda, is that since there is a scenario in which you can take meat from a carbon and eat it the next day, therefore, even when you're not supposed to do that, like burning it on the Mizbeach, if you did it, b'diavad, after the fact, you're allowed to burn it, right? So because we found precedent in a different case, we can rely on that after the fact. Imala lo yerdu. And that's one example. Says Rabbi Yehuda, the next example is yotzei, right? You take meat or blood and you bring it outside the Beit HaMikdash, it's puzzle. If you bring it back in and put it on the Mizbeach, you don't take it off. You know why? Because there is a case where meat that's outside the Mizbeach is kosher. And what's the case? Yotzei kasher bebama. Think about a bama. If you have remember the times that you were allowed to have a bama, you would have a Mizbeach in your backyard and you would check an animal and put it on that. Clearly, it's outside the Beit HaMikdash. Now, again, it's not really relevant because it's a whole different situation. But the point is that since sometimes you find Yotze is kosher, therefore, even when it's not kosher, b'diavad, you can do it. That's Rabbi Yehuda's formulation. Tamei, the same thing is true about tamei, right? You have a piece of meat that's tamei, you bring it back into the Beit HaMikdash, put it on the Mizbeach, you can leave it up there. You know why? Because there are times where a tamei thing is allowed to be brought on the Mizbeach. For example, hoel v'hutar lavadat sibor, right? Let's say that tzibor is tamei. Remember Pesach, we learned all about this. Tuma is hutra b'tzibor. So if the tzibor, for a karban tzibor, you have people being tamei, rov tzibor tamei, or all the kohanim, whatever the case might be, then you're allowed to do it b'tuma. And since there are scenarios, however rare and however unrelated, in which you can do an animal b'tuma, therefore, anytime an animal is tamei, im Allah lo yered. If it goes up, don't take it off. What's the next case Rabbi Yehuda would include? What about chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, which is a very interesting answer, right? Where am I? Chutz lizmano, or I guess halfway down or halfway up. Chutz lizmano, ho meratzeh lepigulo. Remember that this was a complicated discussion we've had many times in the Masechta, which is that if you shecht an animal with the thought that you're going to sprinkle the blood tomorrow, right? That's called pigul, and you're chayiv karet for that animal, right? But we learned many, many times that the only way you're chayiv karet is if the rest of the animal was done kosher, right? Meaning you have to do everything else kihalacha. If you don't, it's not pigul, because pigul means basically a carbon that everything is right except for that one detail, right? And so, and otherwise it's not pigul. It's possible, but it's not pigul. But therefore, says the Gemara really interestingly, if you think about it, basically, in order for an animal to be pigul, the blood has to be sprinkled on the mizbeach. The meat has to be burned on the mizbeach, right? Excuse me. And therefore, you can see that there is basically a function of burning that meat on the mizbeach. It's not to make the animal kosher, but it makes it pigul. So read the words inside. Ho umiratzeh lepigulo. It is essentially the process you're supposed to follow, not supposed to, but need to follow for it to become pigul. So basically, there is a function of burning an animal, even though it's pasul chutz lizmano. And therefore, even when there's no function for that, we would leave it on the mizbeach. And chutz l'mkomo is the same thing, right? Remember, chutz l'mkomo, excuse me, it's not pigul, but it always follows the same rules, basically, of pigul. So hov itkish l'chutz l'zmano, since it's compared, or hekish, to chutz l'zmano. So again, all of these things are cases where there is a function, either in a very rare situation, like a tumah hutra b'tzibor, or a bama, or pigol, where there's a function to bringing it on the mizbeach. Or the final case we're going to do in the Braita is what about the case of kiblu psulin v'zarku et damo? Right? We said if someone puzzle accepted the blood or sprinkled it, why would that be kosher if you then put it on the mizbeach? So Rabbi Yehuda would have to explain it's talking about hanach psuli dechaz avodat tzibur. It's talking about specific psulim that would be allowed to be done for avodat tzibur. And what is that? Someone who's tameh, right? Meaning not a zar. So not like I said in the Mishnah, me, right? If a zar did it, then it would not be kosher on the mizbeach to stay up, right? Of course, it's puzzle, just to be clear. If a puzzle accepted the blood, the whole carbon's puzzle. But if they, by mistake, took the meat and put it on the mizbeach, or the blood, but if the person who accepted it was a Kohen Tameh, then according to Rabbi Yehuda, you leave it on the Mizbeach. Why? Because sometimes a Kohen Tameh can do avoda. For example, if everyone is Tameh, right? So since sometimes a Kohen Tameh can do avoda, in this situation, we will leave it on the Mizbeach. So it has to be referring to a case where it's a Hanach Psuli to Chazla Avodat Sibor. So anyways, so basically what we're saying is that according to Rabbi Shimon, it's very easy, right? Zot Torah Olah tells you, Torah Olah, every Olah or every Karban that's brought up can stay on the Mizbeach. Except Zot limits those that are Pasul B'Kodesh, or Pasul Shalo B'Kodesh, sorry, before you got to Kodesh. Rabbi Yehuda says it's a lot more complicated. That basically any animal that, or this is complicated, but I'm going to say one way to say this, that by the fact that the Torah excluded three things, right, which is what Rabbi Yehuda said earlier, it said the word zot, it said he, and it said ha, olah, the hey, tells you that generally some things can stay on the Mizbeach and some things cannot stay on the Mizbeach. Which ones can? The ones that can are ones that are similar to a situation where sometimes it would be okay to have this psul on the Mizbeach, right? And so, for example, lan, since sometimes you can eat the meat of a carbon shlomim the next day, if you leave the meat on the mizbeach, I'm sorry, if you leave the meat overnight and then put it on the mizbeach, you can leave it up. Yotzei, for example, for a bama. So that is Rabbi Yehuda's understanding. So it's limited, much more limited than Rabbi Shimon. Ask the Gemara, I understand you, Rabbi Yehuda, but it sounds like you're really what you're comparing doesn't make any sense. Because says the Gemara now, davar shelo behechshero davar shebehechshero. How do you compare something that's not kosher to something that's kosher? Right? A carbon shlamim on the second day is supposed to be eaten. It's not a consolation that you're allowed to eat a carbon shlamim on the next day, even though it stayed overnight. It's the appropriate way to eat a carbon shlamim, right? or the bama, for example, right? You can't say a carbon is mutter on a bama even though it's outside the Beit HaMikdash. The definition of a bama is that it's outside the Beit HaMikdash. So how could you take that and say, oh well, since we permit it in that case, we'll permit it in this case? It doesn't make it, it's a little too far, says the Gemara. Says the Gemara, you're right. This whole thing is a little bit sneaky because Tana azot Torah Tola riba samakle. The truth is that Rabbi Yehuda relies on the same drasha of Rabbi Shimon, right? The Torah says zot Torah Tola. It says this Torah Tola, meaning all olot have the same halacha, im Allah lo tered. So the truth is he really relies on Rabbi Shimon. The difference between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon is Rabbi Yehuda says the Torah limits more things, right? According to Rabbi Shimon, it's clear cut. It's psulo b'kodesh imala lo tered. Psulo shelo b'kodesh imala tered. Very straightforward. But says Rabbi Yehuda, it's more complicated than that because the Torah limits more things. The Torah says zot, it says he, it says ha'olah, and so therefore the Torah is saying there are actually more things that are limited. What are those more things? So here Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, look, anything in which you can find a precedent that it's permitted in a similar circumstance in any case, like a tameh on Yom Kippur or Karim Pesach or a bama, then I will permit that. But other things I will not permit. But really, at the base of it, he's relying on the same limud as Rabbi Shimon, which is that Zot Torah Olah tells you that all olot are permitted on Mizbeach. So really, it's a combination, but that's what he's relying on. Now, we'll do a few more lines because it's a short daf. Says Rabbi Yochanan something very interesting. Let me give a little background here, and we'll switch gears quickly. And the background here is this is a preview of what's going to come in around 3 weeks. Okay, so you'll appreciate the heads up, which is that towards the end of the Masechta, we talk about a concept called shchutei chutz, right? Remember, there's many psukim in the Torah which are confusing psukim, and we're going to discuss them later, that basically say if you have a karban el olam moed lo levio, right, the karban lashem, then you are chayev for karet or mitabi de shamayim. There's different categories. So if you have a karban, you don't bring it to the Oel Moed and you shecht it as a karban outside the Beit HaMikdash, you're over for what's called shchutei chutz, and there's a separate category called halat chutz, something that you burn outside, right? So you take a karban that's supposed to be in the Beit HaMikdash, you shecht it outside, let's say, and you burn it outside, you're chayiv twice actually, shchita and hala, okay? So basically, anything that's supposed to be done in the Beit HaMikdash that you do outside is a problem of it's a lotase in the Torah of shchutei chutz or halat chutz, right? Shechting it or sacrificing it outside. Now, says the Gemara something very, very interesting. You would think that if something was done and was possible for the Mizbeach, right? So think about it this way. Something that's possible for the Mizbeach that you then shechted and brought outside on a Mizbeach, you're not chayav for that. Because since you couldn't do it inside the Beit HaMikdash, doing it outside the Beit HaMikdash is not over the Isser, right? Taking a Balmum, for example, and shechting it outside the Beit HaMikdash and putting it on a Mizbeach outside the Beit HaMikdash shouldn't be prohibited because it's not like you violated not doing it in the Beit HaMikdash. You're not allowed to do it in the Beit HaMikdash. However, now that our Mishnah said that if you took a balmum and you put it on the not a balmum, if you took a tameh, let's say, and you put it on the mizbeach, even though it's not supposed to go on the mizbeach, im Allah lo tered, now all of a sudden you've expanded what's chayav for shchutei chutz, because since if I put this tameh animal on the mizbeach, I would leave it up. If I put the tameh animal on the mizbeach outside, maybe that's a prohibition, right? So basically, we have to think about what implications there are for expanding the use of the Mizbeach inside on the chiyuv of not using Mizbeach outside. So in that context, says Rabbi Yochanan, 3 lines from the bottom, says Rabbi Yochanan, let's say you're shochet behima balayla bifnim. You take an animal, and it's supposed to be a karban, a ola, let's say, and it's at night, and you shecht it in the Beit HaMikdash, okay? Which, remember, you're not allowed to do, right? That's puzzle. And the Kohanim scream at you and they say, this is puzzle, you got to throw it away. And you say, wait, you know what? Heck with this. I'm going to take it outside and shecht it and burn it myself at home, right? So the question then is, are you chayav for halat chutz, right? Because you're not allowed to do it in the Beit HaMikdash. But remember, if you did it in the Beit HaMikdash, according to Rabbi Shimon, it would stay on the Mizbeach, right? Because it's psula b'kodesh. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that was one of the exceptions, right? It says Rabbi Yehuda said, if you do shechita at night, you don't leave it on the mizbeach. So you might think that according to Rabbi Yehuda, if you then burn that animal outside the Beit HaMikdash, you're not chayav for halat chutz because you couldn't do it inside the Beit HaMikdash. Says Rabbi Yochanan, you're wrong if you think that. Hashochet dehema balayla bifnim vehala bechutz. You would still be chayav even according to Rabbi Yehuda. Why is that? Right? Because remember, this case is Rabbi Yehuda's case, which if you put it on the mizbeach, we would take it off. So why, if you brought it on a mizbeach outside the Beit HaMikdash, are you chayav? Because says Rabbi Yochanan, lo tehei pechuta mishochet bechutz umale bechutz. Because you would at least treat it like an animal you shechted outside and put up on the mizbeach outside. Meaning, if you take a karban and instead of going to Beit HaMikdash, you decide it's too far, I don't feel like going, and I take my karban ola and shecht it in my backyard, and then put it on my altar in my backyard. The Gemara is going to say later that you're chayiv twice. You're chayiv for shchutei chutz, because you shechted it outside, and you're chayiv for halat chutz. Now, why are you chayiv for halat chutz? Because if the shechita was done in your backyard, it's possible. You couldn't go bring that on the mizbeach, right? But still, the fact that you're chayiv shows that since the action is an action that you could do at home, you'd be chayiv. So says Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Yehuda, even though imalat tered, you'd be chayiv for halat chutz. That was Rabbi Yochanan's innovation. Now, Matav Rabbi Chia bar Avin asked Rabbi Chia bar Avin, what about the following Braita? The Braita says, and this is all in the Gemara later, in Daf Kuf Yud Aleph here, the Gemara is going to say later the following. Let's say you are shochet of bifnim. Let's say you take a bird that's supposed to be a karban, and you shecht it inside the Beit HaMikdash. Now, you remember that with the bird, you're not supposed to shecht the bird. You're supposed to do malika of a bird, right? So you did the wrong thing. And says the Braita, uma'aleh b'chutz. And then you take that bird, and they, again, same situation, they scream at you and they say, why'd you shech the bird? It's supposed to be killed with malika. So you get upset, you go outside, and you put it on your bama at home, right? Says the Braita later, patur, you're patur. Why are you putter? Because since the shchita is not the right way to kill a bird for a carbon, you basically never got this thing started, right? I'm just going to finish the Braita. Shachat b'chutz, but if you shecht a bird that's supposed to be a carbon outside at your home, and ma'aleh b'chutz, you're chayav, right? So the Braita says later that if you do the shechita inside the Beit Hamikdash, it's puzzle because you're supposed to do malika, and therefore there's no isser, there's no prohibition of burning that outside the Beit Hamikdash. But if you did shechita outside the Beit Hamikdash of a carbon, then that's the way you're supposed to kill it. And then if you put it on the mizbeach, you're chayiv. But why don't says Reb Chia bar Avin, according to you, Rabbi Yochanan, why don't you say the same logic? Nema, why don't you say lo tehei pechuta mishochet umaleh bechutz? I don't get it. Why would you say that the shechita of the animal inside makes it that after that, if you burn it, it's no longer considered to be burning a carbon? It's just like you said in Rabbi Yehuda that if you shecht an animal at night, it's still chayiv outside because it shouldn't be less than shochet u'ma'aleh b'chutz. Same thing would be true here. If you shecht a bird inside the Beit HaMikdash, why would it be potter if you then bring it outside? If you shechted it outside, you'd be chayiv. So why is it less if you do it inside? And tiyufta, clearly this shows that Rabbi Yochanan's logic is wrong and he is mistaken. Or, 5 lines on the top, it could be that shchitat of bifnim mikto katle. It could be that we actually, when we think about shechting a bird bifnim, we don't even think of that as shchita, right? Because since it's just mikto katle means you're just killing it, meaning it's not an act of shechita because the act. How are you supposed to kill a bird inside with malika? And so, since you didn't do malika, it's not as if when you shecht an animal outside, basically, that's the right thing to do for that animal, right? Because when you have a carbon, that's what you're supposed to do. Not a carbon. When you have a not carbon, a regular chicken, that's what you're supposed to do. So therefore, it's a normal shechita outside the Beit Hamikdash. But when you do shechita inside the Beit Hamikdash, you're doing the completely wrong act. You're supposed to do malika, and therefore, basically, it's possible that shechita of a bird is considered nothing. And that's why the Braita says, if you then take the meat of that bird and burn it outside, you're not chayiv for halat chutz. But if you do shechita of an animal at night in the Beit Hamikdash, even though it's at night and it's puzzle, if it was not a carbon and it was a regular healthy animal and you wanted to eat it, you're allowed to shecht an animal at night. There's no prohibition of shechita at night as long as you have lights, right? You have to see it. But there's no prohibition, and therefore that's why Rabbi Yochanan might say that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, that you couldn't put that animal on the mizbeach if you put on inside the real mizbeach. If you put it on your mizbeach outside, you would be chayiv for halat chutz. So that is a interesting, I would say, detail, and we're going to stop there and continue tomorrow actually in this sort of discussion. So very, very complex Gemaras, but it's getting a little easier. So maybe because we're smarter. Shavua tov, everyone.
Shavua tov.
See you later, Nava.
Yep. See you later too.